September 14th, 1986, 3:47 a.m. Sosis Station, Keflavik, Iceland. Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb pressed his headphones tighter against his ears, his coffee growing cold beside him. Something was wrong. The acoustic signature on his screen shouldn't exist. For 17 years, Webb had listened to Soviet submarines. He knew their sounds better than his own heartbeat. The grinding of their propellers, the whine of their machinery, the unmistakable acoustic fingerprint that made every Soviet submarine light up on American sonar like a Christmas tree. But the sound coming through his headphones right now made his blood run cold. Because it wasn't a Soviet sound. It was American. Webb's hands trembled as he adjusted the gain on his equipment, desperately hoping for a malfunction. But the signature remained unchanged. Somewhere beneath the freezing waters of the Norwegian Sea, a Soviet submarine was running silent. Not just quiet, silent. Using the exact same acoustic dampening technology that the United States Navy had spent $2 billion in 15 years developing, technology that was supposed to be the most closely guarded secret in the entire American military. Webb picked up the red phone beside his console, the direct line to the National Security Agency. His voice cracked as he spoke the words that would trigger the largest counterintelligence investigation in American history. "Sir, we have a problem. That sound, that's our submarine. But it's flying a Soviet flag. If you're finding this story compelling, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Trust me, what comes next is going to blow your mind." To understand how the Soviet Union managed to steal the crown jewels of American submarine technology, we need to go back almost 2 decades, back to a small, unremarkable house in Norfolk, Virginia. Back to a man whose betrayal would cost American lives, compromise national security for nearly 20 years, and come closer to tipping the balance of the Cold War than any other single act of espionage in history. His name was John Anthony Walker, Jr., and in December of 1967, he walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and changed the course of history. But here's what makes this story truly terrifying. Walker wasn't a communist ideologue. He wasn't motivated by political beliefs or a desire to see the Soviet Union triumph. He walked into that embassy for the most mundane reason imaginable. He needed money. John Walker was a Navy warrant officer stationed aboard the nuclear submarine USS Andrew Jackson. He had a wife, 4 children, a bar he'd invested in that was hemorrhaging cash, and a mountain of debt that grew larger every month. His marriage was falling apart. His life was spiraling out of control. And somewhere in the depths of his desperation, he made a calculation that would haunt American intelligence for generations. Walker knew something valuable. He knew the Navy's communication codes, the encryption keys that protected every message sent by every American naval vessel around the world, and he knew that the Soviets would pay handsomely for that information. What happened next reads like something out of a spy novel, except every word of it is true. Walker didn't just hand over a few documents. He didn't provide information for a few months and then get cold feet. For the next 18 years, John Walker operated as a Soviet spy inside the United States Navy, eventually recruiting his own son, his brother, and his best friend into an espionage ring that would become known as the most damaging spy operation in American history. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to that cold December night in 1967. The Soviet embassy on 16th Street in Washington, D.C. was under constant surveillance by the FBI. Every car that pulled into the driveway, every person who walked through those gates, was photographed, documented, and investigated. The Soviets knew this, of course, and they had developed elaborate protocols for handling potential intelligence assets. Walker parked his car 3 blocks away. He walked past the embassy once, then circled back, checking for surveillance. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Every shadow seemed to contain an FBI agent. Every passing car seemed to slow down just a little too much. But no one stopped him. He approached the embassy gate and rang the bell. A security guard appeared, eyeing him suspiciously through the wrought iron bars. "I need to speak with someone," Walker said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I have information about the United States Navy." The guard's expression didn't change. He picked up a phone, spoke rapidly in Russian, then hung up. "Wait here." 20 minutes passed. Walker stood in the cold, second-guessing his decision, fighting the urge to run. Then the gate opened and a man in a dark suit emerged. "Come with me," the man said in accented English. "Quickly." Inside the embassy, Walker was led to a small room on the 2nd floor. The walls were bare except for a portrait of Lenin. A single desk sat in the center, and behind it sat a man who introduced himself only as Yuri. But his real name was Yuri Linkov, a senior officer in the KGB's first chief directorate, and he was about to make the most valuable recruitment of his career. "What do you have?" Linkov asked, his tone businesslike. Walker reached into his coat and pulled out a single sheet of paper. On it was a partial encryption key, a small sample of what he could provide. Linkoff studied the document for less than 30 seconds. Then he looked up at Walker with eyes that had evaluated dozens of potential agents, weeding out the frauds, the double agents, the unstable personalities who would inevitably crack under pressure. "How much do you want?" $1,000 a week, Walker said, "every week, for as long as I can provide material." Linkoff nodded slowly. "And you can provide more of this?" "I can provide everything, every code, every cipher, every change, the moment it happens." What Walker didn't realize, what he couldn't have known, was that he had just handed the Soviet Union the keys to the kingdom. The Navy's communication codes weren't just used for routine messages. They protected information about submarine deployments, weapon systems, operational plans, and most critically, the technical specifications of America's most advanced nuclear submarines. But here's the question that would haunt American intelligence officials for decades. How did the Soviets turn that communication access into stolen submarine technology? The answer involves a web of espionage so complex, so far-reaching, that when it was finally unraveled, it would shake the very foundations of American national security. For the first few years, Walker provided exactly what he had promised. Every month, he would photograph classified documents, hide them in dead drops around the Washington area, and collect his payments. The money flowed in, steady and reliable. His debts disappeared, his lifestyle improved, and the Soviets devoured every piece of information he provided. But the real value of Walker's intelligence wasn't immediately apparent. You see, the communication codes he was providing allowed the Soviets to decrypt American naval messages in near real time. They could read operational orders, they could track submarine deployments, they could monitor exercises and evaluate American tactics. But more importantly, they could read the technical reports. In 1968, the United States Navy was in the midst of a technological revolution. A new generation of nuclear submarines was being developed, quieter and more capable than anything that had come before. The Los Angeles-class attack submarine program was in its early stages, and engineers were working on acoustic dampening technologies that would make these vessels virtually undetectable. Every technical specification, every engineering breakthrough, every failed experiment was documented in classified reports, reports that were transmitted using the very encryption systems that Walker was compromising. And the Soviets were reading every word. But they had a problem. Even with access to the technical information, they lacked the manufacturing capability to replicate American submarine technology. Soviet machine tools weren't precise enough. Their metallurgy wasn't advanced enough. They could understand what the Americans were doing, but they couldn't copy it. That problem would take 15 years to solve. And when it was finally solved, it wouldn't be through espionage alone. It would be through an act of corporate greed that would become one of the greatest scandals of the Cold War. But before we get to that, something happened in 1975 that would expand the Walker spy ring into something far more dangerous than a single disgruntled sailor selling secrets for cash. In the summer of that year, Walker recruited his own son. Michael Walker was 19 years old when his father approached him with a proposition. The young man had just enlisted in the Navy, following in his father's footsteps. He was assigned to the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz, where he worked as a yeoman, handling classified documents. The conversation happened in their family kitchen, late at night, after Michael's mother had gone to bed. "I need to tell you something," John Walker said, pouring himself a whiskey. "Something important." Michael sat across from his father, confused. Their relationship had always been complicated. John was distant, often absent, prone to unexplained trips and secretive phone calls. "What is it?" John Walker took a long drink, then set down his glass. "I work for the Russians. I have for years, and I need your help." Michael's first reaction was disbelief. His second was fear. But his third reaction, the one that would seal his fate, was curiosity. "What kind of help?" "You have access to documents. Important documents. All I need you to do is photograph them, I'll handle everything else, and I'll pay you, generously." What John Walker didn't tell his son was the full scope of what he was asking. He didn't explain that Michael would be committing treason. He didn't mention the potential consequences, the decades in federal prison that awaited if they were caught. He presented it as a simple business arrangement, a way for Michael to make money while serving his country. Michael agreed. Over the next 10 years, Michael Walker would photograph thousands of classified documents aboard the Nimitz and later aboard other vessels. He provided information on fleet operations, weapon systems, and most critically, the technical capabilities of the carrier battle groups that formed the backbone of American naval power. But John Walker wasn't satisfied with just his son. In 1980, he recruited his older brother Arthur, a retired Navy lieutenant commander who still had contacts within the defense industry. And in 1982, he brought in Jerry Whitworth, a senior chief radio man who had access to some of the Navy's most sensitive communication systems. The Walker spy ring was now a family business, and the intelligence they were providing was devastating. Soviet naval commanders suddenly seemed to know exactly where American submarines were operating. They could predict patrol patterns with uncanny accuracy. Their anti-submarine warfare tactics improved dramatically, as if they were reading from American training manuals. Because in fact, they were. But the full impact of the Walker Ring's betrayal wouldn't become clear until years later. Until that night in September 1986, when Senior Chief Webb sat in his listening station in Iceland and heard the impossible. A Soviet submarine that sounded American. Let me take you back to that moment, because what happened next would trigger a cascade of revelations that would rock the American intelligence community to its core. After Webb made his initial report, the recording was transmitted immediately to the National Security Agency headquarters at Fort Meade, Maryland. Within hours, it was being analyzed by the agency's top acoustic specialists, men and women who had spent their careers studying the sounds of the deep. Dr. Eleanor Vance was the lead analyst assigned to the case. She had been with NSA for 23 years, and she had never seen anything like this. "It's not possible," she said, staring at the spectrographic analysis on her screen. "This sound profile, it matches our 688 class?" "Exactly." The 688 class was the Los Angeles-class attack submarine, the crown jewel of the American submarine fleet. Its acoustic dampening technology was so advanced that it could operate within miles of Soviet vessels without detection. The propeller design alone had taken 7 years to develop, using computer modeling techniques that didn't exist anywhere else in the world. "Could it be one of ours?" asked Commander David Chen, the NSA liaison to the Office of Naval Intelligence. Dr. Vance shook her head. "We've checked. Every 688 is accounted for. This boat is Soviet, but it's running with our sound signature." "How is that possible?" That question would take months to answer, and when the answer finally came, it would reveal a conspiracy that stretched from a Japanese boardroom to a Norwegian factory to the deepest secrets of the American defense establishment. But first, let's talk about propellers. To understand why the Soviets couldn't simply copy American submarine technology, you need to understand the science of acoustic detection. Submarines are found primarily through the sounds they make. The churning of their propellers creates cavitation, tiny bubbles that collapse and generate noise. The vibration of their machinery travels through the hull. Every submarine has an acoustic signature as unique as a fingerprint. American submarines were quiet because of 2 technologies. The first was mounting machinery on sound-absorbing rafts that isolated vibrations from the hull. The second was propeller design. The propellers on a Los Angeles-class submarine were machined to tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch. Each blade was precisely curved to minimize cavitation. The manufacturing process required 9-axis computer-controlled milling machines, technology so advanced that it was classified as a strategic asset and prohibited from export. The Soviets had been trying to develop similar technology for years. They had stolen the designs through Walker and other espionage operations. They understood the theory, but they couldn't build the machines needed to manufacture the propellers. Until 1981. That year, executives at Toshiba Machine Company in Japan and Kongsberg Våpenfabrik in Norway made a decision that would alter the balance of power in the Cold War. They decided to sell the Soviets exactly what they needed. The deal was brokered in secret, in violation of international export controls that had been specifically designed to prevent this exact scenario. Toshiba would provide the computer-controlled milling machines. Kongsberg would provide the software to run them. And the Soviets would pay handsomely through a series of shell companies and bank transfers designed to obscure the true nature of the transaction. The sale was worth approximately $17 million. It would cost the United States hundreds of billions in additional defense spending to counter the resulting Soviet submarine threat. But at the time, no one in the American intelligence community knew any of this. The Toshiba-Kongsberg scandal wouldn't be revealed until 1987, and only then because of a Japanese whistleblower who couldn't live with his conscience. So when Dr. Vance sat in her office at Fort Meade, staring at that impossible acoustic signature, she was seeing the end result of a conspiracy she didn't even know existed. "We need to bring in the FBI," she said finally. "Someone talked, someone gave them our technology, and we need to find out who." The investigation that followed would be one of the largest counterintelligence operations in American history. It would eventually uncover the Walker spy ring, the Toshiba-Kongsberg sale, and a network of compromised personnel that reached into the highest levels of the defense establishment. But that investigation almost didn't happen, because there was someone inside the intelligence community who was working to make sure the truth never came out. His name was Aldrich Ames, and he was a senior officer in the CIA's Soviet Counterintelligence Division. But that's a story for another time. Let's focus on what happened in the weeks following Dr. Vance's discovery. The first break in the case came not from sophisticated intelligence analysis, but from a phone call to the FBI's field office in Boston. Barbara Walker, John Walker's ex-wife, had been carrying a secret for nearly 17 years. She had known about her husband's espionage almost from the beginning. He had told her, in a moment of drunken bragging, about his arrangement with the Soviets. She had kept silent out of fear, out of some twisted sense of loyalty, and later out of pure inertia. But in November 1984, she picked up the phone and called the FBI. "I want to report a spy," she said. "My ex-husband. He's been selling secrets to the Russians for years." The agent who took the call was skeptical. They received hundreds of similar tips every year, most of them from disgruntled ex-spouses making false accusations. But something about Barbara Walker's calm, detailed account caught his attention. "How do you know this?" he asked. "Because he told me. He showed me the money, and I can tell you exactly how it works. The dead drops, the signals, everything." The FBI opened an investigation, codenamed Windflyer. For the next 6 months, agents followed John Walker's every move. They watched him make dead drops in rural Maryland. They photographed him meeting with his Soviet handlers. They documented a pattern of espionage that had been operating undetected for nearly 2 decades. On May 20th, 1985, the FBI arrested John Walker at a Ramada Inn in Rockville, Maryland, just hours after he had made a dead drop containing classified documents. In his car, agents found detailed instructions from his Soviet handlers, a list of future meeting locations, and over $100,000 in cash. The arrest of John Walker was front-page news across the country, but the full scope of his betrayal was only beginning to emerge. Under interrogation, Walker maintained his composure. He had prepared for this possibility for years, developing a cover story that he hoped would minimize his sentence. He claimed that the information he provided was outdated, of limited value, nothing that would have seriously harmed national security. The interrogators didn't believe him. "Let me tell you what we know," said FBI Special Agent Robert Hunter, sliding a folder across the table. "We know about Michael, we know about Arthur, we know about Whitworth, and we know exactly what you've been giving the Soviets." Walker's face went pale. "You didn't just sell them codes," Hunter continued. "You sold them our submarine technology, you sold them our tactics, you sold them the ability to track every boat we put in the water." "That's not true," Walker protested. "I never had access to—" "Save it." Hunter opened the folder and began laying photographs on the table. Satellite images of Soviet shipyards, technical drawings of submarine propellers, acoustic analyses showing the dramatic improvement in Soviet submarine technology over the previous decade. "You see this?" Hunter pointed to one of the images. "This is a Victor III submarine, photographed last year. Notice anything different about the propeller?" Walker stared at the image, his jaw tightening. "It's a 7-blade design, precision machined. The same design we use on our 688 class." Hunter leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You gave them this, John. You and your little ring. You handed them the keys to our entire submarine fleet." "I didn't give them any submarine designs," Walker insisted. "I only provided communication codes." "And what do you think those codes protected? What do you think was in those messages you let them read?" Walker had no answer. The truth was, he had never fully understood the value of what he was selling. He saw the codes as abstract strings of numbers and letters, puzzles to be copied and traded for cash. He never considered that those codes protected information about the most advanced weapon systems in the world. But the Soviets understood. They had understood from the very first document Walker handed over. The trial of John Walker and his accomplices took place in 1986. The proceedings revealed, for the first time, the staggering scope of the damage they had caused. Navy Secretary John Lehman testified that the Walker ring had provided the Soviets with access to over 1 million classified messages. The compromised information included submarine deployment schedules, weapon system specifications, and detailed technical reports on virtually every major Navy program. But the most damaging revelation came from a Soviet defector, a former KGB officer named Vitaly Yurchenko, who had briefly defected to the United States before changing his mind and returning to Moscow. During his time in American custody, Yurchenko had provided a chilling assessment of the Walker ring's value. "Walker was the most important spy we ever had," Yurchenko said. "The information he provided changed the entire direction of Soviet submarine development. Because of Walker, we knew exactly what we needed to build. We knew what worked and what didn't. He saved us years of research and billions of rubles." John Walker was sentenced to life in prison. His son Michael received 25 years. His brother Arthur got 3 life sentences. Jerry Whitworth, who had provided some of the most sensitive technical information, received a sentence of 365 years. But the damage they had done could not be undone. And there was still one more piece of the puzzle to uncover. Remember that Soviet submarine that Senior Chief Webb detected in September 1986? The one that sounded impossibly American? The Walker Rings espionage explained how the Soviets knew what to build, but it didn't explain how they had managed to actually manufacture the technology. That answer came from a completely unexpected source. In early 1987, a Japanese journalist named Shigehiro Hagawara received an anonymous package at his office in Tokyo. Inside were internal documents from Toshiba Machine Company detailing a secret sale to the Soviet Union. The documents showed that in 1981, Toshiba had sold 4 MBP 110 milling machines to the Soviets through a Norwegian intermediary. These machines were capable of machining submarine propellers to the precise tolerances needed for silent running. They were classified as strategic technology and explicitly prohibited from export to the Soviet bloc. Toshiba had sold them anyway. The machines were shipped through multiple countries to obscure their destination. The paperwork was falsified to disguise their true capabilities. And Norwegian company Kongsberg Våpenfabrik had provided the software necessary to operate them, software specifically designed for machining submarine propellers. When the story broke, it caused an international scandal. The United States Congress passed sanctions against both companies. Toshiba's stock price plummeted. Executives were arrested and prosecuted. But the damage was done. American intelligence analysts estimated that the Toshiba Kongsberg sale had advanced Soviet submarine technology by a decade or more. The new generation of Soviet submarines, the Akula class, was so quiet that American detection systems struggled to track them. Admiral James Watkins, Chief of Naval Operations, testified before Congress about the implications. "We spent 2 decades developing our acoustic advantage," Watkins said. "We spent hundreds of billions of dollars on technology that was supposed to keep us safe. And in one transaction, that advantage was given away." The convergence of the Walker spy ring and the Toshiba Kongsberg sale represented a perfect storm of espionage and corporate greed. Walker gave the Soviets the blueprints. Toshiba and Kongsberg gave them the tools. Together, they erased America's most critical strategic advantage in submarine warfare. But this story isn't just about technology and espionage. It's about the human cost of betrayal. Let me tell you about a man named Lieutenant Commander Michael Hayes. Hayes was a submarine officer assigned to the USS Dallas, a Los Angeles-class attack submarine operating in the North Atlantic. In the early 1980s, his boat was tracking a Soviet submarine during a routine patrol. The mission should have been simple. American submarines were so much quieter than their Soviet counterparts that they could follow them at close range without being detected. The Dallas had done it dozens of times. But something went wrong. The Soviet submarine, which had shown no indication of detecting the Dallas, suddenly changed course and headed directly toward the American boat. Hayes and his crew were forced into a series of desperate maneuvers, diving deep and running silent to avoid detection. They escaped, but just barely. For years, Hayes wondered how the Soviet captain had known they were there. The Dallas had done everything right. Their sound discipline was perfect. There was no reason the Soviets should have detected them. After the Walker case was exposed, Hayes finally understood. The Soviets hadn't detected the Dallas acoustically. They had known where the American submarine would be because they were reading the Navy's communications. Walker had given them the ability to track American submarine movements in near real time. Hayes testified at the sentencing hearing for Jerry Whitworth, the spy who had provided the most detailed communication intelligence. "I want you to understand what you did," Hayes said, his voice steady but filled with barely contained anger. "My crew lived because we were lucky. We were one mistake away from a collision at depth, one mistake away from dying at the bottom of the ocean. And you put us there. You put us in that position because you wanted money." Whitworth sat motionless as Hayes spoke, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. "I don't know how many other crews were in the same situation," Hayes continued. "I don't know how many close calls there were that we'll never hear about. But I know this. You betrayed every single person who ever served on a submarine. You betrayed your country for cash. And as far as I'm concerned, there's no punishment that can make up for that." The courtroom was silent as Hayes returned to his seat. Even Whitworth's defense attorneys had no response. In the years following the Walker case, the Navy implemented massive changes to its communication security protocols. New encryption systems were developed, procedures were revised, personnel screening was tightened. But the damage to submarine technology couldn't be reversed through better procedures. The Soviets had the machines, they had the knowledge, and they were building a new generation of submarines that would threaten American naval supremacy for decades to come. The full extent of the technology transfer became clear in 1992, when American intelligence analysts finally obtained detailed information about the Soviet Akula-class submarine. The Akula was everything American planners had feared. Its acoustic signature was nearly identical to that of American submarines. Its propeller design was clearly derived from American technology. It could operate in the same waters as American boats without being detected. One senior Navy officer, speaking on condition of anonymity, described the Akula revelation in stark terms. For 30 years we had the advantage. We could go anywhere, do anything, and they couldn't find us. Now they can do the same thing. The underwater battlefield is level for the first time since World War II. The implications extended far beyond submarine warfare. The Soviet Union, and later Russia, used the technology to develop an entire generation of quiet submarines. The Chinese obtained similar technology through their own espionage operations. By the end of the Cold War, the acoustic advantage that had once been America's greatest naval asset had effectively disappeared. And it all traced back to two sources: a disgruntled Navy warrant officer who needed money to pay his bills, and a pair of corporations that saw profit where they should have seen danger. But let me leave you with one final piece of this story, one final revelation that shows just how close America came to disaster. In 1985, the same year John Walker was arrested, the Soviet Union came within minutes of launching a nuclear-first strike against the United States. The incident, known as the Autumn Forge false alarm, occurred during NATO military exercises in Europe. Soviet early warning systems detected what appeared to be an incoming American nuclear attack. Alarm sounded in Moscow. Military commanders prepared for immediate retaliation. For approximately 23 minutes, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. The false alarm was eventually identified, and the crisis passed. But American intelligence later discovered a chilling detail. The Soviet response had been so rapid, so well coordinated, because Soviet commanders knew exactly where American nuclear submarines were positioned. They knew because John Walker had told them. The encryption keys Walker provided allowed the Soviets to track American ballistic missile submarines, the underwater deterrent that formed the backbone of American nuclear strategy. During the Autumn Forge crisis, Soviet commanders believed they had a narrow window to destroy those submarines before they could launch their missiles. If the false alarm had lasted a few minutes longer, if one Soviet commander had made a different decision, the world we know might have ended. And it all would have started with a desperate man walking into an embassy on a cold December night, looking for a way to pay his debts. John Walker died in federal prison in 2014 at the age of 77. He never expressed remorse for his actions. In interviews, he maintained that his espionage had been a victimless crime, that the information he provided was of limited value. The evidence says otherwise. The Walker spy ring compromised more than 1 million classified documents. It provided the Soviet Union with detailed knowledge of American submarine technology. Combined with the Toshiba Kongsberg sale, it erased decades of technological advantage and cost the United States hundreds of billions of dollars in additional defense spending. More importantly, it put American lives at risk. Submarine crews operated in waters where they thought they were undetectable, never knowing that Soviet commanders could track their every move. How many close calls occurred that we'll never know about? How many American sailors survived only because of luck? Those questions can never be fully answered. But the lesson of the Walker case is clear. In the shadow world of espionage, the most dangerous threats often come from the most ordinary people, not ideological true believers, not trained foreign agents, but ordinary men and women who make ordinary choices for ordinary reasons. John Walker wasn't a master spy. He was a failed businessman with a gambling problem and a broken marriage. He walked into the Soviet embassy because he was desperate, because he saw an opportunity, because he convinced himself that what he was doing didn't really matter. And that's what made him so dangerous. The Toshiba and Kongsberg executives who approved the machine sales weren't enemy agents either. They were businessmen who saw a profitable deal and chose not to ask too many questions. They convinced themselves that export controls were bureaucratic obstacles, that the end-user certifications were formalities, that their actions couldn't possibly have serious consequences. And that's what made them so dangerous, too. The story of how the Soviet Union stole American submarine technology isn't a story about brilliant spycraft or sophisticated intelligence operations. It's a story about ordinary human failings, greed, desperation, willful ignorance, the ability to convince ourselves that what we're doing doesn't really matter. In the end, the most expensive secrets are rarely stolen by enemies. They're given away by friends. Think about that the next time you hear about a security breach or a data theft or a compromised system. Think about the ordinary people who made ordinary choices and changed the course of history. Because somewhere, right now, there's another John Walker. Another desperate person looking for a way out, another businessman willing to cut corners for profit, another secret waiting to be sold. The question is whether we'll catch them in time. Senior Chief Marcus Webb retired from the Navy in 1992. He never forgot the sound that woke him that night in Iceland, the impossible acoustic signature that proved everything had changed. In a 2003 interview, Webb reflected on what that moment meant. I spent my whole career listening to the ocean, Webb said. I knew every sound, every signature. I could tell you what submarine was out there just by the way it moved through the water. And then one night, I heard something that shouldn't exist. A Soviet boat that sounded American. That's when I knew we'd lost something that could never be recovered. When asked what he thought about John Walker and the others who had betrayed their country, Webb paused for a long moment. I try not to think about them too much, he finally said. Because when I do, I get angry, really angry. They didn't just sell secrets. They sold my friends. They sold every sailor who ever went beneath the waves thinking they were safe. They sold our future for pocket change. And the worst part? They got away with it for years, almost 2 decades. All because nobody thought to ask the right questions. Webb shook his head slowly. We spend billions on satellites and spy planes and electronic surveillance. But in the end, the most important intelligence came from a phone call. An ex-wife who finally decided to tell the truth. That's what brought down the biggest spy ring in American history. Kind of makes you wonder what else is out there. What other secrets are being sold right now while we're not paying attention? The Walker spy ring was dismantled. Toshiba and Kongsberg were punished. New security measures were implemented. But the damage to American submarine technology was permanent. Today, the United States and Russia continue to operate sophisticated submarine fleets. American boats are still among the quietest in the world thanks to continued technological innovation. But the overwhelming advantage that once made American submarines virtually undetectable no longer exists. The playing field was leveled by a failed businessman with gambling debts and a pair of corporations that chose profit over security. And somewhere in the depths of the ocean, submarines from a dozen nations patrol silently using technology that traces its origins back to that cold December night in 1967. The night John Walker walked into the Soviet embassy and changed the world. That's the real cost of espionage, not just the secrets lost or the technology stolen, but the knowledge that somewhere out there, someone is always watching, someone is always listening, and the next betrayal is always just around the corner. The question isn't whether it will happen again. The question is whether we'll be ready when it does. There's one more chapter to this story that deserves to be told, one that shows how the ripples of the Walker betrayal continued to spread long after the spy ring was dismantled. In 1994, nearly a decade after John Walker's arrest, American intelligence officials were analyzing the results of the START treaty verification process. As part of the agreement with Russia, both nations were exchanging information about their nuclear arsenals. What the Americans discovered shocked them. Russian nuclear submarines had been upgraded with technology that bore an unmistakable resemblance to American designs. Not just the propeller systems that had been traced to the Toshiba Kongsberg sale, but acoustic dampening materials, reactor quieting systems, and hull designs that seemed to have been lifted directly from classified American reports. The Walker ring, it turned out, had provided far more than communication codes. The messages they allowed the Soviets to decrypt had contained detailed technical specifications for virtually every major submarine system, material that American naval intelligence had assumed was protected by multiple layers of security. Admiral William Crowe, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, later described the revelation in stark terms. We operated for years under the assumption that our submarine technology was secure, Crowe said. We thought the codes were just communication tools. We didn't realize that those codes protected the crown jewels of our entire naval strategy. The full accounting of what the Walker ring compromised took years to complete. Intelligence analysts poured through records, reconstructed what information had been transmitted through compromised channels, and traced the resulting Soviet technological improvements. The final assessment was devastating. The Walker ring had compromised information on submarine construction techniques, reactor designs, sonar systems, weapons guidance, torpedo countermeasures, communication protocols. Virtually every aspect of American submarine operations had been exposed. The cost to remedy the damage was estimated at over $300 billion in additional defense spending over the following 2 decades. New submarines had to be designed with different acoustic signatures. Communication systems had to be completely rebuilt. Operational procedures had to be rewritten from scratch. But the most profound impact was psychological. For an entire generation of submarine officers, the Walker case became a defining moment. They had spent their careers believing they operated in relative safety, confident that American technology gave them an insurmountable advantage. The revelation that this advantage had been systematically betrayed for almost 2 decades shattered that confidence. Captain Thomas Reed commanded 3 different attack submarines during the 1980s and 1990s. In a 2010 memoir, he described the impact of learning about the Walker ring. There were missions I ran where I took risks based on our assumed acoustic advantage, Reed wrote. Operations where we got close to Soviet boats because we believed they couldn't detect us. After the Walker case broke, I went back and reviewed those missions. Every single one of them was more dangerous than I thought at the time. We weren't invisible. We never were. The Soviets knew exactly where we were and what we were doing. They were just waiting for the right moment to use that information. Reed paused before continuing. I spent years wondering what would have happened if they had decided to act on that intelligence. If there had been a crisis, if someone had given an order, how many of my crew would have died because of what Walker sold to the Russians? And that's the question that keeps me up at night. Not what did happen, but what could have happened. What almost happened. The Walker case also prompted a fundamental rethinking of how the military approached personnel security. Before the scandal, background investigations focused primarily on identifying potential ideological threats. Communist sympathizers, anti-government activists, people who might betray their country out of conviction. Walker didn't fit that profile. He was a patriotic American who had served his country honorably for years before his desperation drove him to espionage. His background check revealed nothing suspicious. His performance evaluations were excellent. There was no indication that he was anything other than a loyal sailor. After the Walker case, security protocols were revised to look for different warning signs: financial difficulties, excessive debt, lifestyle changes that didn't match reported income. The assumption that only ideologues posed a threat was replaced by a more nuanced understanding of human vulnerability. These changes came too late to prevent the damage Walker caused, but they may have prevented future betrayals. We'll never know how many potential spies were identified and stopped because of lessons learned from the Walker case. But one thing is certain. The world changed that night in Iceland when Senior Chief Webb heard a sound that shouldn't exist. The certainty that had defined American submarine strategy for decades evaporated in an instant. And in its place came a new reality, a world where nothing could be taken for granted, where every assumption had to be questioned, where the greatest threats came not from enemy weapons, but from enemy knowledge. The sound that Senior Chief Webb heard that night in Iceland wasn't just an acoustic signature, it was a warning, a reminder that in the shadow war between nations, nothing is ever truly secure. And sometimes, the most dangerous enemy isn't the one across the ocean. It's the one standing right beside you. The Walker case file remains partially classified to this day. Certain details about the intelligence he compromised and the methods the Soviets used to exploit that intelligence are still considered too sensitive to release. But the lesson is clear. In the eternal struggle between secrecy and betrayal, the betrayers only need to succeed once. The defenders have to succeed every single time. And sometimes, despite all our efforts, despite all our technology, despite all our vigilance, a single ordinary person making a single desperate choice can change everything. That's the true legacy of John Walker. Not the secrets he stole, not the technology he compromised, but the reminder that in the world of intelligence, the most dangerous threats are often the ones we never see coming. The ones that sound just like us.